I think it's almost a mindset shift that you have to make as a consultant where because we as experts get really tied up in what we do and how excited we are about what we're going to deliver and what we can teach and train on. We have to have a mindset shift around what does the business need and move away from this idea of covering everything and making sure that people have learned lots, in quotation marks, to
Hello and welcome to Smart Profit AI. Today we're exploring what's next for professional training and why the future of learning goes beyond completion rates. For years, corporate training success was measured by how many people finished a course or clicked complete, but today's leading organizations are shifting focus from counting completion rates to tracking capability and commercial impact. Our guest today has built an entire business around that shift. I'm joined by Jessica Lorimer, founder of Selling to Corporate, which helps consultants and trainers sell, design, and deliver programs that actually change business outcomes, not just learner dashboards. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you.
To start, could you tell us about selling to corporate and what inspired you to bridge that gap between learning professionals and corporate decision makers?
Yeah, of course. So firstly, thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation and I think it's one that's massively needed at the moment. So it must have been 18 years ago now that I got into sales, which feels like a lifetime ago. But about 12 years ago, I realized that actually my passion was in the teaching and training side of teaching other salespeople how to do things in a best practice way. And that coincided with me being diagnosed with myalgic encephalitis. So it's a chronic condition and meant that I wasn't really able to pull some of the hours that I had been pulling as a professional salesperson in organizations. So the idea of selling to corporate was, how can I go into companies as a consultant myself and teach their sales people the strategies and techniques that I had been using myself, that I'd developed to use with sales teams that I had managed,
Yeah.
and that had been really, really successful and effective, that had kind of come away from the 90s hard sell type sales. And over time, I started to realize there were other people like me who had come from industry and who were wanting to become consultants for whatever reason. Sometimes it was that people had become parents and wanted to have a career that was more flexible. Sometimes it was that people just sick and tired of full-time employment. Sometimes it was that they were tired of the red tape around their organizations. But I discovered these consultants who wanted to work with organizations and were incredibly capable experts in their field, but had no sales experience. And that was stopping them getting consistent clients. It was stopping them earning, and ultimately meaning that they weren't becoming the consultants they'd wanted to be. They were running businesses that felt more like expensive hobbies than startups and professional development companies.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds really interesting. And when did you first realize that corporate clients were looking for more than just a course completion numbers?
I think that's always been evident to me, to be honest. And maybe I sit in a privileged position coming from a sales background, but in sales, you're only as good as your last deal. So sales trainers and sales consultants historically have had to always prove that their training works and is effective at desk rather than just being a tick box exercise or tokenistic. I think that companies from a wider scale around other areas like health and wellness, for example, health and safety, things around operations, fractional consultancy, etc. They started to realize probably around COVID that actually what they were paying for were courses that looked great, that had amazing branding, that had really good salespeople at the helm in some cases, but they weren't seeing the implementation of those techniques. And that really came to a fore, I think, during COVID, because obviously everything was being scrutinized in a way that companies hadn't been doing when everybody was just at desk and working. And so suddenly they were tracking people's time and they were tracking activities and the return on investment from those
Yeah.
activities. And they were seeing growth in other areas that perhaps they hadn't monitored before. So at that time, we saw a huge shift for organizations in realizing that it wasn't enough anymore to say to people, well, just go and do the health and safety quiz and assume that they're fine. They had to be putting more at the forefront, and they had to be making sure that people were actually using the techniques, particularly in regulated areas, so that they weren't liable for
Yeah.
problems, and they weren't having to pay out extra in litigation and things like
Yeah.
that.
Okay. So let's dig into that shift a bit more. So how do you help experts rethink what they're selling from training content to just like a business capability?
I think it's almost a mindset shift that you have to make as a consultant, where because we as experts get really tied up in what we do and how excited we are about what we're going to deliver and what we can teach and train on. We have to have a mindset shift around what does the business need and move away from this idea of covering everything and making sure that people have learned lots, in quotation marks, to actually asking in sales calls what the priority is. What's the outcome that the organization actually want? And focusing very specifically on training the techniques and learning materials that are needed for that learner to be able to go back to their desk away
Yeah.
from that training day with all of the busy noise of their normal job and remember how to use a specific technique or practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's funny you say mindset because every talk I get into, they always mention mindset, and a mindset is a really big thing. Like it can really make or break how your business works or how you start your business, or even with the um like business as a whole, you always need the correct mindset. So it's really interesting that you said that.
It's a huge part of it, right? And your mindset determines, like you're just saying there, it determines how you run your business, it determines the success of your business.
Yeah.
It also determines how resilient you are as
Yeah.
a coach and a consultant and a trainer, because a lot of the time you're going to go to organizations and not
Yeah.
everybody wants you to be there.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
everybody wants to turn up to your training session
Yeah.
and think,
Of
oh my
course.
gosh, I'm going to learn so much. Instead, they're
Yeah.
like, oh God, not another
No.
one. Let's get out of here as quickly as
Yeah.
possible. I think having that mindset reframe and understanding what the commercial priorities are and not feeling like you're there to just give lots and lots of information,
Yeah.
but actually you're there as a practitioner who is supporting other people in their practice in what they're learning. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
That's what companies are really looking for now.
Yeah. 100%. I do agree with you. Okay. So what are corporate buyers actually asking for now compared to 5 years ago?
I think the change has been vast. And I think I think the market might tell you, or the common market might tell you one thing, and what I
Yeah.
might be completely different.
Yeah. Let's hear your
Well, let's go controversial. I think, 5 years ago, we were in what everybody determined as unprecedented times. And I think that for organizations, this was a real wake up, not because of the pandemic necessarily, but because we were also thrown into political changes and historic events that catapulted the lives of their employees in completely different ways. We had humanitarian crises, we had racial or racially aggravated incidents, which were hugely prevalent in the press. These things were causing real damage and emotional harm to employees and making it almost impossible. Combined with a pandemic and people having children at home full time and all of these things made it really impossible for employees to focus on
yeah.
their jobs, because at the end of the day we're all humans. We can't just be robots and turn up and do
Yeah.
whatever, even though we're miserable, even though we're really frustrated the way the world's playing out. And
Yeah.
unfortunately the landscape around the world for political climate, humanitarian crises, and ongoing business as usual work inside organizations, those things haven't really changed. What has changed is the way that companies are trying to approach them and trying to support employees through them. So we've realized since 2020 that actually there is a significant return on investment for
Yeah.
companies who invest in health and wellness
Yeah.
solutions for employees. There is actually a productivity related return on investment there, which is something that perhaps companies didn't look at before in the same way. We've also realized things like all the tools that we use. So AI is the current conversation that's happening, and
Yeah.
the use of artificial intelligence, that actually companies are using it poorly and that it's actually costing them a
Of course.
significant amount
Yeah.
per employee for poor usage of AI, which isn't something that we would have thought about in 2020.
Yeah.
And that's even before we touch on the things that are happening, in the UK, for example, things like the Employment Rights Bill are
Hmm.
changing. And so people's statutory rights are changing at work. And again, these changes, whether they're regulated or politically driven or driven by what's going on in the world in general, all of these changes means that companies are prioritizing things like health and wellness,
Yeah.
particularly mental health.
Of course.
They're trying to take preventative measures in areas like human resources so that they're not getting hit by big legal bills when things come up that could have been avoidable.
Yeah.
And they're really working on things like corporate social responsibility programs as well to try and impact and genuinely impact the world around
Yeah.
them as organizations, because buyer perception and Gen Z in particular, we're driven now by values. Do we have
Yeah.
common values with an organization? Do we
Yeah.
believe in them? So companies are really having to move probably faster than they
Yeah.
have had to move in the last 50 years on topics. And I think that means there's much more room for
Hmm.
innovation. Certainly, I see that there's much more need for consultants and providers who are able to change perceptions, change
Yeah.
beliefs, change behaviors. But it does mean that the old ways, if you like,
Yeah.
are dying out. Companies aren't willing to pay the big consultancy bills for somebody who's just going to sit there and tell them the same old thing that
Mhm.
they did in 1985. And why should they, right? The world's changed, so we all need to move along.
Yeah. Okay. And how, in your opinion, how can learning providers prove value without drowning in data?
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting conversation that really should happen during the sales process, is looking at how a company is planning on measuring the success of a program or an implementation and asking what they want, which
Yeah.
sounds so simple. But I
Yeah.
think as learning providers, we tend to focus on what we can give them and how we can give extra value.
Yeah.
And actually, there's no point creating 10-page reports if what your measurable outcomes are, how many new leads is somebody generating, or how many
Course.
sales
Yeah.
are they making, or
Yeah.
how many people are, how many fewer people are taking time off work
Uh,
through stress or whatever. So I think this is about setting expectations with
yeah.
the client early and
Yeah. Of
asking how they plan to measure the success of an outcome, and then giving them the best route to do that and charging appropriately for it, obviously.
course. Yeah. Okay, that sounds interesting. Let's shift focus onto the future of professional training. So we're
Mm.
clearly moving into a more outcomes driven world. What do you think the next generation of professional training will look like, especially with AI and hybrid learning in the mix?
So I think, and this from a sales perspective, so it's not the same for every um, business entity, but AI really is causing huge issues when utilized poorly. So I mentioned a study earlier that they'd figured out AI was costing £186 per employee when used poorly for organizations. And certainly in sales, where we are humans talking to humans, it's problematic because it's meaning that communication has gone down. People don't know how to talk to each other anymore. They struggle with written communication because there's always a robot who'll do it for them. So I think it's interesting because for professional learning providers, organizations are really having to be more specific about the skills that
Yeah.
they want their learners to have. And for professional learning providers, I think that means we're going to almost return to a world where we see more in person training, where we see more real time practice
Yeah.
of skills. Certainly in the sales world, I spend a lot more of my time now on role plays and on shadowing and at desk learning than we do on traditional training kind of classes, if you like, or the online classes that were so popular during 2020 to 2022. I think the other thing that we have to consider is the generational gap.
Yeah.
So learning providers now actually have to account for the fact that we have the most generations in the workplace than ever before. We're going everything from boomer to Gen Z at the moment. And that means that we're having to look at a lot of different learning styles.
Yeah.
And we're having to work with people who have different frames of reference, different life experience. So we also need to make sure that training is inclusive around generation, around gender, all
Yeah.
of those kinds of topics. And so I think we're actually in a really exciting space
Yeah.
where, if done properly, professional learning providers can work with organizations in a co-creative way to design specific learning outcomes and programs of work that really benefit organizations and that benefit the learners and actually get more professional development in the hands of the people who need it. The other risk is that everybody could turn around and say, oh, I just can't be bothered. So what we are trying to combat, I think a lot of us as professional learning and development execs, is
Of course.
trying to make sure that people aren't outsourcing the learning.
Yeah.
There's been a real spate of people just typing into AI,
Yeah.
"Can I teach?"
You want AI to help you, but you don't want AI to overtake everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's about finding that balance,
Yeah.
and supporting people to use it in the right way where it's necessary, and actually empower people to avoid using it where they could be developing competence and confidence themselves.
Yeah. Okay. And for smaller training businesses, then how can they stay relevant as corporate clients demand deeper results?
So I think always going to be more relevant.
Yeah.
Smaller training providers can do things that much larger training providers can't. We can be much more agile and adaptive to the market and to the needs of the organization because we're not put upon by the red tape that bigger organizations have where they have to sell certain product suites or certain service suites. So I think that agility and ability to be adaptive is huge in the current
Yeah.
market.
Of course.
I also think that for a lot of the learning providers and training providers that you'll be talking to on this podcast, they're experts in their field. They've spent years honing their skills and their certifications and things like that. So for them, when an organization hires them, they're getting the 15, 20 years experience that that person has.
Yeah.
They're getting the passion, the motivation, the certifications, the real time practice that that person has. When an organization hires a big learning provider, it's not necessarily the case. What they're paying for are the salespeople and the sales team who will sell the learning provision. They're paying for the branding that's been paid for, to a big marketing agency. They're paying for the marketing budget. They're paying for the flagship offices in cities around the globe. They're paying for the social media profile, the LinkedIn training. Like, the actual person who comes and delivers
Yeah.
the training itself may not be qualified in the same way as the smaller provider, may not have the same experience.
Yeah.
And so, actually, what learning providers need to think about is not how can I be relevant or how can I justify that I am better? It's actually relying on the expertise that they have and being able to engage in sales processes that allow them to showcase that. So
Yeah.
instead of being an order taker and going to a sales call and the client telling you, this is what we want, this is what we're going to have, this is what we're willing to pay,
Yeah.
it's for that learning provider to be able to reframe that conversation and actually start talking to the client about the commercial benefits that they want, the outcomes that they're interested in, and showing themselves as the expert from the get go rather than it feeling a bit like a kiosk experience.
Yeah. Of course. And how can leaders balance measurable results with the human side of learning,
Mm.
like motivation, trust, or behavior change? I know you touched upon it, but yeah.
I think it's a really good question. Not everybody is going to be motivated all the time.
Yeah.
I think we have to accept that as providers, and I also think companies have to accept it. I also think from an employee perspective that they're being paid to do a job. So some of the work is on their part to accept. I may
Yeah.
not want to do this training, or I
Yeah.
may not be interested,
Yeah.
but actually I've been paid to be here to learn. So there has to be a relationship, there has to be trust between the educator and the person in the room. And I think that one of the best ways to do that is to get that buy-in when you arrive
Yeah.
as the educator from the room and acknowledge, I do a lot with sales training. Most of the time, the people I'm teaching are really capable, really competent. They are doing the job every day. So actually, my job isn't there to be teaching them things they already know. It's to give them the 2% that give them an edge.
Yeah.
And so sometimes when you're positioning it that way, it makes the learner feel more comfortable. And that's the way the company gets better results because
Yeah.
the learner isn't then offended that you think they don't know anything. They're turning up and they're saying, okay, cool, we're open minded.
Yeah.
Let's find out what that 2% is. So I think, there has to be that symbiotic relationship. And I also think that learning providers have to manage the expectations of organizations around the depth of transformational outcome that they can achieve with certain things. A company cannot expect a learning provider to go in and deliver a 45-minute lunch and learn on a topic and that suddenly all of their employees will be experts.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
going to happen. So sometimes this is about how we do set those boundaries and expectations during the sales process to
Of
make
course.
sure the customer is actually buying
Yeah.
the relevant solution that's
Yeah.
going to get them the outcome they want,
Of
even if
course.
it means they have to spend more,
Yeah.
or even if it means that they don't do the work this year, they do it next year because that's
Yeah.
when they're going to be more ready, you know?
Of course. Yeah. Okay. So, Jessica, you've worked with so many consultants and companies. What's one key mindset shift you wish every training provider would make?
I think probably the biggest thing is to be conversation focused instead of offer focused. The biggest mindset I see people getting stuck in is this idea that they need to create a suite of offers and price them and brand them and have slide decks. I hate slide decks. I don't understand why anyone has them anymore, but they do. You know, and instead, we should be, as learning providers, open minded to conversations and open minded to having conversations that create solutions that are needed. If you have that mindset, you will always end up being able to charge more, you'll get paid more, and you'll also be much more consultative for your client. And that's always going to get you rebooked with work and ultimately support you in getting the learners to actually achieve the outcomes that the company wants to. And for me, that's what matters.
And let's focus on a bit about your business now. So, what kind of challenges does you face in your business right now, if any?
think I think every business faces challenges, and I've been really fortunate. I've run my own business since 2014, so I think you go through stages. I think when you're new, like everything is a challenge because you go from doing your day-to-day job to suddenly being HR and accounting and everything else. I think if I looked at the challenges in my business now, one of the biggest things that I notice is it is not necessarily about how to run a business, the apathy that I see from other providers. So I think there's this big tendency, particularly this year, to feel like nothing is working. And so people will say nothing works anymore, all these magic tools don't work, blah, blah, blah. And that kind of group think and group negativity is really damaging. And I see it for a lot of my clients where they'll get caught up and they'll all be talking about these things that don't work instead of looking for solutions. And I think for me this year, some of that apathy and negativity has meant that I feel like I'm pushing a boulder up a hill because I'm still here saying, well, it's working. It's just that you need to like take a second and
Yeah.
regroup and have a look at it from this perspective. So I think people who aren't happy with their current consulting or training business need to really focus on, why am I not happy? And actually, am I doing something about that? Rather than just chatting to their friends and being like, oh gosh, yeah, it's really hard here for everybody. And, because telling ourselves that unfortunately normalizes the problem. If you think that everybody is struggling this year, then it's easy to just not do your sales activity, or it's easy not to do your kind of marketing activity. Instead, this year has been one of the best that I've seen in business, that my clients have seen in business. And that's not because, we're miraculous and everyone's just kind of coming to us. It's because we're showing up and we're showing up positively and we're being adaptive to the market and looking for solutions. And I think that's really important.
And where would you say selling to corporate will be in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah. I have no idea. No, that's a joke. We'll be in the same place that we've been for the last 7 years or so. We've spent a lot of time at Selling to Corporate in really honing programs of work, and honing our success rate. So we currently operate at a 96% success rate of clients generating their full ROI back within 6 months, which is significant for us. And that's a real testament to the amount of training. Over the last 10 years, we've trained over 29,000 people in over 20 countries. So we're working with some really solid data around what works and what doesn't work and why those things happen. So for me, over the next 12 months, my job is to help us get into more organizations that need that training and support, and those results where those are important. But it's also to motivate my team and make sure that people are happy over the next 6 to 12 months to be involved in that bigger mission. Because I'm always conscious that when I make decisions about growth or expansion, it's not just me that has to change. It's not just me that has to work hard, right?
Yeah.
So I think for me, that's the big piece is how can I do that and make sure that my team are on board, that they're happy, that they're motivated, and that they're being compensated for the effort that they're putting in, and that we're rewarding and recognizing people for that effort. That's really important for me.
Okay. Well, Jessica, thank you so much for joining me today. I love how you've reframed what success looks like in the professional learning. It's not just about ticking boxes, it's about building capability that sticks. For anyone listening that want to learn more about selling to courses, where should they go?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a free podcast called Selling to Corporate. It's sorry. So we've got a free podcast called Selling to Corporate. It's on iTunes, Spotify, and all major podcast players. Or you can come over to LinkedIn. I'm there. I'm Jess Lorimer on LinkedIn. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one, but you never know. You might find a different one who's more interesting. If you do, let me know. And you can come and find me there and have a chat after.
Hey, great. And to our audience, if you enjoyed this episode, be sharing, liking, and giving us a review. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.